Hi there, folks. Mark Austin here to talk with you a little bit today about Web 2.0 and why the heck are we making all the mistakes we've made over and over again with technology yet again. By the way, you'll notice I'm wearing my New York Mets hat. That's, of course, in honor of the fact that springtime is here, and so it's time for the New York Mets to make another run at the National League pennant. But back to what's most important, which is the issue at hand, Web 2.0, and why are we making the same mistakes over and over again? And we are. Before moving on, let me just tell you a little bit about myself. I've been working in the nonprofit sector for about 25 years now. It's been a long time. I started my work in institutions, working in organizations like Greenpeace USA, the Public Interest Research Group, which is a Ralph Nader spin-off organization. And one of the things that I learned back then, as well as over the years as I worked in the education sector and otherwise, is that there are a lot of limitations and opportunities that exist within institutional frameworks in organizations. Where there is strong leadership, where there is a learning culture, there is the capability for incredible things to happen. Where there is a lack of leadership, where there is a culture that isn't as open to learning and experimentation, we don't see a lot of innovation, and we see organizations that are not as effective. That's the angle through which I want to talk with you today a little bit in relation to Web 2.0 and our current use in the sector of those tools and strategies. Let me start off by talking a little bit about issues of balance. One of the things that I think is notable is that as we see new technologies hit the marketplace and then become ubiquitous within society, I think what we often find is the reaction somewhat can be extreme. And we witness this in the nonprofit sector fairly regularly, especially when it comes to ICT, to information communications technologies. I think what we find is that there is an immediate excitement to adopt new technologies, and there are quite a few people who will jump right on and say, we need to do this, this is what other people are doing, we've got to catch up to the for-profit sector, we must do this. On the other side, the other extreme being, we can't touch this stuff, we don't know enough, we don't have the capacity, it's not right for us. Now, of course, there are a lot of people who fall in between, but I think these two extremes are fairly common, and I think it's something that all of us would say is pretty familiar. And I have a concern about this, particularly in relation to the Web 2.0 tools and strategies that are emerging out there in society. This is really irritating me, frankly, and the reason it's irritating is because we keep going around and around and around over and over again in relation to the way that we're approaching some of these issues. My concern is that we're reinventing the same mistake that we've been making over and over again in relation to transformative technologies. What we're doing is we're either jumping in too fast or we're not jumping in at all. Instead of taking a more experimental approach and taking a more measured approach to learning as we go. So for me, the question is around balance. It's not around whether or not we're keeping up with one organization over there, or whether or not our knee-jerk reaction is we don't have the time or energy to even bother with something. The question is whether or not we can find someplace in between the extremes. Someplace that values asking questions about what it is we could possibly do, identifying why we might do it, and then determining whether or not we have the capacity to pull it off, and finding a way to create the capacity to experiment and learn. If we look back, we can see, for example, when the World Wide Web hit the airwaves. And immediately, this was going to be the solution to organizations' marketing needs, a little bit later on to organizational needs to connect with stakeholders and activate them, and so on and so on. We could talk about CRM systems, customer relationship management database software. And I think we're seeing the same thing there. You know, organizations spending lots of money on database software, but not having the processes in place or even the human systems in place to understand their constituents, to take the data that they might collect about their constituents and make something of it. Maybe it's a lack of analytical capability within the organization. Maybe it's just the fact the organization doesn't take the time to analyze the information it collects. Maybe the organization isn't clear exactly on what information it needs to collect, and not having gone through a process to identify those things and then connecting to organizational strategy, I think, is a concern. I think another area where this comes up is in relation to online community organizing and online engagement. I think we find, I think statistics show, more than 75% of online community building efforts fail. I would guess the number is much higher than that. Why is that? Why do we seem to make the same mistakes over and over again? In that area of online organizing, what do we see? We see that we're failing to stick with the basic principles of community organizing, which are transferable into the online space to a great degree. What have we learned about community organizing? We've learned that it's about people, it's about trust, it's about relationships and connections. It's not about pushing out more and more and more content. It's not about how fast you make it happen sometimes. It's about some of these more basic parts of what it means to connect people to each other. So down the line, if we take a look at the introduction of ICT into the nonprofit sector, I think we see an imbalance. I think we see a lot of examples of that. Now, of course, there are examples of organizations that are not out of balance, but I think the vast majority are, and I think it's something for us to be very concerned about as we look at the potential for Web 2.0 technologies to be used for social change and social action. So if we go ahead and then want to look at what is it we need to do to be more effective at applying these tools and applying these strategies in a way that truly will improve effectiveness, will truly result in the kinds of outcomes we're shooting for, I think there are a couple of things we need to be thinking about.